So good evening, good afternoon, for those of you who are joining us in real time. For those of you who are watching this later on the recording, greetings wherever you're at in the world. I'm Dr. Jamie Marich with the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, trauma author, scholar, and teacher. And I am delighted to be joined today by author Amber Cantorna-Wylde, who is the author of Out of Focus. I just received my copy in the mail yesterday, my Story of Sexuality, Shame, and Toxic Evangelicalism. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you so much for having me.
So for those people who are listening that may not be aware, tell us what that phrase means for you, toxic evangelicalism, because I knew because I grew up in it, but if you kind of had to give the starting place, where would you go?
Well, it feels like a bit of a loaded question, doesn't it?
I
Because
know.
there's so much behind that. It's actually really hard, I feel like, to describe evangelicalism to someone that hasn't experienced it. In fact, my girlfriend grew up Lutheran, and she just is having a hard time wrapping her mind around like this world of evangelical. Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? Because she didn't experience it, right?
Right.
But for those of us that have experienced it, I think we've come to know it for it being very toxic in so many ways, because it has caused so much harm in terms of religious trauma and identity suppression and sexual purity and what that means, and who we're supposed to be, and how we're supposed to love ourselves and how we're supposed to love one another. And it came with so many rules attached, so many check boxes of things that you had to do to appease God, that you had to kind of make yourself smaller and smaller and smaller to try to fit inside this little box, right?
Right.
And eventually you feel like there's nothing left of yourself, or you've lost yourself, because you've had to make yourself so small. And so I think a lot of recovering from that kind of toxic evangelicalism is learning to trust our intuition, trust our voice, trust our gut, learn how to take up space in a room or in a relationship, learn how to love ourselves, learn that we are lovable, learn how to love others regardless of sexuality or sexual orientation, gender identity, those things. And it's a lot of undoing that religious trauma and reprogramming the way that we think. So it really is kind of this massive package and undertaking that so many of us have had to go through, I think.
Right. So to a point you made, I want listeners to grasp that there are all different kinds of Christianity.
Yes.
And Christianity is my lane of expertise, having grown up in it, and that being the source of my spiritual trauma. You mentioned the Lutheran Church, which we might consider more of a mainline mainline Protestant denomination. I grew up with one Catholic parent, and a lot of the same themes overlap in Catholicism and the evangelical movement, although there's a lot of animosity between the two. Purity culture and shame around sexuality seem to be a common denominator. But the evangelical movement is rather new in the scope of the evolution of Christianity.
Correct.
Yet it really took hold in the US in the last century. And you grew up in a family that was connected to one of the big evangelical organizations focused on the family.
Correct.
I think makes your story of coming out, the bravery of it even more compelling. But if we can kind of start with, what was that like for you growing up, being who you are in that kind of environment? Anything you want to share is open table.
Well, I think one thing that it did is that it made my world very small. My dad worked in a very high-powered position at Focus on the Family for 35 years. He's still employed there, as far as I know. And so our whole world revolved around everything Christian. There was no life outside of that, outside of Focus on the Family, outside of church, outside of, everything was in this bubble. So our world was very small, in a group of people where everybody thought and believed exactly like you did. So there was no exposure to diversity of any kind. Everybody was white, straight, cisgendered, heteronormative, very, like if you think about the culture wars, they're breeding people because they want to perpetuate the system, right? In terms of like Christian nationalism and having, their beliefs take root in politics. And so everybody had to think and believe exactly the same. And that was their goal, was to then do that to their children. So I was homeschooled all the way. And I was, I didn't ever go to public school. I did Awanas instead of like Girl Scouts. I did, so there was all these things that everything you did had to be Christian based. And so I didn't have that exposure, and I didn't even have the language to understand my own sexuality until much later in life, because there was no exposure or language around it. And so it caused me to learn that I was different very young, but also to that I had to hide who I was very young, because who I was wasn't acceptable, and there was nobody around that looked like me. And so you learn to assimilate, and you learn to hide and suppress your identity. And that, of course, then translates to a lot of mental health and physical health problems down the road, because we're not able to be who we are fully and be seen for who we are. So I would say that, that my world was all things Christian, which then it just made it a very small world, and a very small idea of God, because there was really only one right way, which was the way that we believed. And all these other paths that could lead to God from all other different religions or different forms even of Christianity were unacceptable. There was one right way, and if we were that, and then it was our job to convince everybody else to become that, right? And so there were no even like exploring different ideas or questioning or doubting or wondering. All of that was suppressed. And so you learn to kind of shut down a lot, because you're not allowed to explore.
Shut down and dissociate. And that's, a lot of what my story was as well. Yeah. I love asking fellow people who went through this. And granted, I was not part of such, I guess you would say, like a high exposure family like yours, yet, the focus on the family ideology trickled down to so many of us in the evangelical movement. The James Dobson books were parenting guides. The what was it? The parenting the strong-willed child. I forget.
Yes, how to raise a strong-willed child. Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess I was that strong-willed child. I don't want to give too much away from the book, because I really want to encourage people, to get the book. But at what point did the bubble seem to burst for you? Was it gradual or was it sudden?
Well, I think it was maybe a little bit of both, because it was, in a way, it was sudden, because I really felt completely oblivious to my sexuality until I fell in love with my roommate when I was in my early 20s. And then I had this like shit moment, of like, what is it, and it was like I called it my epiphany of horror, because it was like things were coming alive, but they weren't supposed to be coming alive, but they were, but not with that person, so it was very confusing. But like, of course, looking back now, I can see things from very young age where, my friends were being attracted to boys, and I was being attracted to my friends, and things that I didn't have the knowledge or the vocabulary to put around at the time. But I can certainly see it now, looking back, how even though I didn't have those terms to put with it, or I couldn't quite express it like that, that those things were present from a very young age, and having to hide pieces of myself from so young caused mental health issues to surface from a very young age as well. And so that took a variety of forms.
I have a very similar story, in that it was in my college dorm experience that since I first came out to myself at 19, realized like this is it. And then 20 years of therapy and progressive healing followed. And yes, now that I look back, it's so obvious.
Right.
Yet when I was in it, I don't think I knew any better. I couldn't have.
No, because you didn't have any gay people present to identify with, or to know like, oh, this is what that looks like, or this is what I'm feeling, or this is normal, right? It wasn't allowed to be normal. It wasn't allowed to be accepted, or to be even seen.
And no kind of safety to talk about it. And you just played along or froze to submission to survive in your house, because this is what was expected of you, and we're right and everyone else is wrong. I also really related to that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So for people who follow my work, I want to share that many years ago, when Amber's first book came out, Refocusing My Family, I got it instantly. Just everything about it appealed to me. And I mean, I think anytime I hear anyone else from the evangelical world come out, like even people who I went to church with growing up, because there have been now a handful of us
Right,
come
right.
to light, it always makes me feel so affirmed because,
Yes.
yay, I'm not
You're
the
like, oh, I'm
only
not the only one, right?
who went through this. And in writing my own memoir about growing up half Catholic, half Protestant, which is coming out next year, You Lied to Me About God, I reflected on how I felt when I read Amber's memoir, and I shared it with my mom, and I'm like, let me look up Amber, see what she's up to. And this new book. So tell us a little bit about, the direction of the new book and how it's, kind of the next step in the evolution of your writing.
Well, when I wrote Refocusing My Family, I was pretty newly out still,
Right.
it hadn't been real long. And so I told my story as I knew it at the time. But now here we are 8 years later, and I've been working in advocacy work all that time. And so I feel like not only has my story evolved, but where we stand as queer people in culture right now has evolved and changed. And my voice has just evolved and gotten so much stronger through all that I've personally gone through, but that I've also walked alongside other queer people through. And so this really is kind of not just my story anymore. I think that was something I realized when I wrote Refocusing, is I very quickly realized this is not just my story. This is the story of hundreds and thousands of other queer people who were also influenced by James Dobson and Focus on the Family, evangelicalism. So this is our collective story. And I think I take a bit more of that collective approach with Out of Focus in telling my story, but through the lens of our collective stories and of evangelicalism and the history behind that and the eugenics behind that and things that we don't even realize have influenced evangelicalism and influenced Focus on the Family. I talk about things like the harms of purity culture and conversion therapy, the importance of mental health care and boundaries and self-care, and how identity suppression influences both physical and mental health. All those kind of things are woven through there. Statistics are provided about how that impacts queer people as a whole. And so it's not just my story, but it's kind of taking a larger approach of how evangelicalism has and is affecting queer people today.
Tell us what you mean by the eugenics of all of it, because of everything you said, that really pinged for me just now.
Yeah, well, that whole first section kind of unpacks the way that eugenics have actually been tied into Focus on the Family, which
Wow.
a lot of people don't realize. I didn't realize until I started really digging in and doing the research that Paul Popenoe, who was an atheist eugenicist, was actually a influencer. Like James Dobson was a protege of Paul Popenoe, and so this atheist eugenicist mentored James Dobson, who then created Focus on the Family. And so these things are filtering down, and it is just the more that I researched it myself, the more my eyes were just getting bigger, and your head just wants to explode, because you realize how much that these things are playing into how evangelicalism is influencing people today. And it's just astounding.
Yeah, I very much am connecting the dots, and on behalf of therapists everywhere working with spiritual trauma, I'm so glad you went there. And I'm really going to be curious to see how that unpacks in the book. Now, I did read your second book, Unashamed, as well, about
Yes.
guide for coming out.
Yes.
And I thought that was also very beautifully and practically written. So I know this is also kind of a loaded question, because every story, every situation is unique. A lot of time when I get asked for clinical advice, the answer is it depends. There's so many variables at play. But I mean, if you, because I know you've now mentored many other people who have had to come out in conservative evangelical families, is there kind of one golden piece of wisdom or experience, strength of hope that you might share to somebody who's on the journey?
Well, I would say don't come out until you're ready. Don't let anybody pressure you into coming out. You will know when you're ready. You will know when the time is right for you. You'll just feel it in your gut, and learning to trust that gut and that inner knowing, I think is very important. But I think one of the biggest pieces that influenced my personal coming out was having as much community support around you ahead of time as possible. And not everybody has that luxury, right? Or that the timing falls just right for them. But to whatever degree you're able to kind of get yourself in spaces where you are affirmed and build those relationships before you come out to people that you feel like will not affirm you, I feel like is one of the biggest game changers, because then when you do come out, you have people that will celebrate with you. You have people that will hold space with you. You have people that will hold those hard conversations with you. And then when people may not react the way you want or need them to, you have a base of support to lean on. And I think that that is one of the most life-saving things that you can do, is to really kind of cultivate that community space prior to coming out, so you have something to fall back and lean on in terms of support.
100% agreed. So here's the next big place I want to go with you, because a lot of people don't get this. Do you still identify either as a person of faith or as a Christian?
I would say I still work in a lot of faith and Christian spaces. I am very careful what term I use. I wouldn't say Christian anymore. I would say faith, but what that means is different to me, right? Because of all the religious trauma and because of what Christianity represents right now in America, I think I hold faith in a space that, like, I don't attend church. I still find meaning in spirituality. I find things like meditation very healing, or walking a labyrinth, being outdoors in nature, or having, a time in community with people that I care about. Those things are nurturing and feel life-giving to me. But I do not find meaning in religion the way that I used to, for sure.
No. So that is a thread that's fascinating, because I know people who've come out of religious trauma have all kind of experiences with which to continue to engage with religion and or spirituality, or completely disengage from it.
Well, and I've been there too, right? Like I was there for a long time where I still wanted to engage, and that was still very important to me. And I think over time I've just evolved, and maybe because of the work that I do too with advocacy, and I see the harm that the church is doing to queer people, and I see those things, and it's impacting them and it's impacting me. And I think there's a different way to do faith and to do spirituality that is more healing and more holistic, and more community driven and meaningful, than necessarily like the way that church has been constructed.
And I'm so glad you went there about, in America today, Christian has a meaning in it that does connotate or conjure up a lot of hate. And it's interesting, because as I've deconstructed and reconstructed my beliefs, I like to say I still have one foot in my Christian identity, because there is a lot I've taken from the whole idea that God thought it would be cool to become human. And like, that is what I like about Jesus, and Jesus being a social radical. And a lot of the manipulative interpretations of Christianity, I definitely rejected ages ago. And I'm also a very ecumenical person in terms of I've learned from so many other faith traditions and spiritual paths, and I don't think any one church I could ever attend would ever contain me at this point. Which is why I too don't go to any kind of church regularly, but I do participate in a lot of spiritual communities and a lot of the, activities that you mentioned. So yeah, I'm glad we went there, because especially in this coming year leading up to the election next year, I just get very weary whenever people lead with "I'm a Christian," because it's like, what does that mean?
Right. Which is so sad, right? Because there's so many things we can learn from the person of Jesus. And yet what Christianity is known for right now is anything but resembling that. And so it really is very sad.
Exactly. So in, your writing, you are very pro therapy, pro mental health care. Since a lot of therapists follow my work, I wanted to give you the platform. I mean, obviously folks, get the book. I mean, anything I've read of Amber's has been amazing. And this seems to be even more up our alley as therapists. But if you had a chance to speak to all therapists everywhere about religious trauma, the coming out experience, you have the platform. What would you like?
Oh my gosh. I'm just so grateful, I think, because this is not a conversation that was happening 5-10 years ago at the way it is
Right.
now. And so to see so many more therapists kind of leaning into that space, I think is so necessary, because evangelicalism is so prevalent in America, and therefore religious trauma is so prevalent in America. And so just to have that space, and I think anytime that you can lean in and listen to the voices of queer people, or any other marginalized group that are dealing with religious trauma, you're going to hear threads that are probably bind us all together, but also just I think listening to stories is just so important. I think we can learn so much from listening to stories, and I think that leaning into that space of healing and finding a different, because a lot of people still do want that bit of spirituality, right? They don't want to completely some people do, but some people don't want to completely dismember from faith altogether. They still
Right.
want some of that spirituality, but learning to package it differently in a way that is inclusive and beautiful and celebratory. And I think that is such a gift when you're able to do that. And I think a lot of, like, therapy is a great place to do that, right? To be able to kind of re-examine beliefs and re-examine identity in a safe space. And I think it's we're still undoing a lot of the taboo that comes with therapy, even especially for those that came from religious spaces, because therapy was taboo. And so even getting people to be willing to see a therapist or to lean into that can still be very hard. And so just creating those safe spaces to be able to unpack and to be able to have those conversations, I think, is such a gift and so needed.
I'm really glad you brought that up, that for so many people who grew up in the evangelical movement, or really any kind of conservative Christian religion, therapy is the enemy.
And reprogramming that is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
When you've been taught that, like, therapy meant something was wrong with you, or that you didn't have enough faith, or you weren't praying hard enough, and it was bad if you had to go to therapy. So learning to reprogram that in a way that you see it as a helpful tool that can help you heal and discover new parts of yourself and give you gifts of how to cope differently, or how to process or think differently. Like, it's really hard to get people to see that other side when they that's not how they've been taught, or how they've been ingrained to think.
Right. One of the stories I can share from that is in the church I grew up at, Dobson's curriculum and materials were used all the time. And one time I made a mention to my father, like, oh, we watched a video with this guy, James Dobson. He's a Christian psychologist. My dad's like, there's no such thing. Like, you can't be Christian. And it's like, I'm like, whoa. So I always think it's kind of funny that I ended up, doing this line to work, because it was important for the deprogramming and for getting the shame out of my system.
Well, and I think that is such a huge component. The shame is a massive component of religious trauma, and such another thing that needs to be unpacked in therapy, because I think one thing I realized as I was kind of deconstructing is, like, shame was at the root core of everything that I believed about myself and about God and about who I was supposed to be and how I was supposed to show up in the world. And you believe that who you are at your core is bad and wrong and detestable, and especially as a queer person, right?
Right.
That internalized homophobia that's cultivated from such a young age. And then you add conversion therapy on top of it. They're brainwashing you to hate yourself.
Yes.
And the damage that's done from that sometimes is almost irreparable. Like,
Yes.
there's people that have had such a hard time undoing that. It takes such a toll.
Yeah, and I'm glad you went there too in the book, because yes, as clinical professionals, any of our mainstream licenses denounce the practice. And in certain states and in certain localities, it's outlawed. But we know that a lot of other states and localities are doubling down about, let's say, giving clinical professionals free blank check to discriminate, right? And when a lot of my work I do as a trauma trainer, I do train a lot of therapists who identify as Christian. And we get into these debates about what is ethical in terms of guiding people. And I'm like, under your state license, you can't be doing it. You just can't be. And it's just a damaging practice in my
so
view.
damaging.
And it's damaging enough, I think, when, quote unquote, church-based counselors or pastoral counselors who aren't necessarily trained do it. But if people are encountering it from the clinical mainstream, it's just not acceptable. And that's something I have spoken out about very publicly in the last several years, that one of the narratives with some of the evangelical folks, even in the clinical field, is that, well, people are gay or people are trans as a result of trauma and abuse. So if we clear that up, then we can clear up. And it's like, no, that it has nothing to do with it. People are who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And the practice, I mean, so much of that is still being done, I mean, yes, by clinical psychologists, but also by those lay counselors. And there is no law governing them. And so that's where a lot of the damage is taking place still. And it's so prevalent still. And I'm so grateful for, some of the documentaries like Pray Away that have come out and kind of shed a light on conversion therapy and the harm that's being done, because this is a conversation that we need to be having. There's still 45,000 churches in America that identify as evangelical. And so that means that they're perpetuating these messages still, that being gay or being trans or being non-binary is a sin and detestable in the eyes of God. And so, like I said, you're programming them to hate themselves, which is so toxic, and just can attribute to so many things of, suicidal ideations and self-harm and all those things that so many queer people are dealing with.
Right. And the documentary Pray Away, Amber mentioned, it's on the top of my recommendation list for any therapist to watch. And for people who've survived this, I would say just take good care of yourself when you watch it. Because I remember 5 minutes in, I was just walloped. And then I'm glad I watched it. And I recommend it to anybody in my life, especially who has any kind of pastoral influence. And, there's also a lot in that document.
Yeah, there is. If you're a queer person, you kind of got to prepare yourself and put the trigger warning out there, because it is tough.
Yes.
But it's such a needed resource. And the other one that I would say is so pivotal right now at this time is the 1946 documentary. That
I haven't seen it yet, but it's on my list. I know about it.
If you get a chance to see it, it is so worth it, because so many people believe that the word homosexual has just like always been in the Bible, right? Like for eons and like as far back as the Bible goes, and that simply is not true. And this documentary proves that the first time that the word homosexual ever entered the Bible wasn't until 1946, which is like in our parents' lifetime, or our grandparents' lifetime. Like it's in the last 70 some years. And it's such a short period of time, and yet it's done so much damage. And the research that they have unpacked has been so life-changing, and I think really has the potential to change the course of history for queer people in the church going forward, if you can really get enough momentum behind it.
I'm excited to check it out. It's been on the list, but now I'm definitely gonna jump it up to the top. So everyone,
and the work of Kathy Baldock as a whole is phenomenal. She's also got her book Walking the Bridgeless Canyon, which is packed full of research, and then her new one, which I believe is coming out maybe in the spring, will be kind of paired with the documentary 1946, but the book will be called Forging a Sacred Weapon: How the Bible Became Anti-Gay. And so that is packed full of information as well. Her work is so important.
And I tell anybody who grew up, especially with evangelical or really conservative Catholic influence, because again, those were my lanes of experience. For every, horrendous message you've encountered from a pastor or a church figure, there are affirming pastors out there now. There are affirming churches. There are affirming scholars who have really done a lot of this heavy work. And I know some of that may also require some deprogramming to even approach, because I know even when I started picking up some books by affirming pastors, I heard my dad's voice in my head. Well, these people are soft. They're not of God. And whatnot. And then, you have a mind of your own, you have a heart of your own. If no one has told you that before, I'm telling you that now. And what feels true to you is worthy information.
Absolutely.
So Tell folks how they can connect with you. Obviously, the book is out and available where books are sold. Out of Focus, My Story of Sexuality, Shame, and Toxic Evangelicalism. Kind of what else do you do in the world, and how can people connect with you?
You can find me at ambercantorna-wylde.com. I am doing a big book launch coming up on November 4th in Colorado Springs. So if you're in the Colorado area, I would love for you to join us for that. It's going to be a really special night, and we'll have music by Out Loud Men's Chorus, and author Kathy Escobar will be there moderating the conversation. And so that's going to be a really special night if you happen to be in the Colorado area. I also lead an online community called the Unashamed Love Collective. And that is kind of a safe space for anybody that's deconstructing or reconstructing to come. We've got queer people in there, we've got allies, we've got parents of queer kids. It's just such a special space to be able to kind of be secluded from the rest of the world and ask hard questions that maybe you're not safe to ask wherever you live. And so it's really a supportive group, and we do a number of different things in there and ways that we can learn, but you can check that out at unashamedlovecollective.com. We do virtual meetings every month where we get to engage and build community with one another. And we've read a number of books and hosted different authors in the group. And so it's just really a special place that not everybody has, an affirming community where they live. And so this gives them an opportunity to really connect and build relationships across states with other people. And the relationships that have come out of that have been absolutely phenomenal and so beautiful. And so it's just really a great, safe group of people to plug in with. So that would be another place to find me. And then just keep up to date on things like social media and my website, see where I'll be speaking in the, with the new year, with the new book, invite me to come speak where you live, all those things. So yeah, I would love to connect with you.
Great. Well, I will plug all of these resources in the YouTube notes, wherever I repost the interview. And Amber, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.